evening. Welcome. It seems we were only here yesterday. My name is Cindy Prizio, and I am Executive Director of One Standard of Justice. And I have loved ones on both sides of the same coin, both equally traumatized and harmed by the legal system. Many of us on the call tonight are restorative justice practitioners. One person from Maine answers the registration question, "What describes you?" Her response: she is a citizen of a country with a broken judicial system. Others might say the judicial system is doing what it was intended to do: punishment without repair, restoration, and healing. Either way, it leaves us wanting. Today, we are joined by many who return year after year. India and Canada were fighting for the last slot tonight. For those of us who identify as a victim survivor, the stories you hear tonight may be distressing to you. Please take care of yourself, whatever that means to you. I must thank Senator Winfield, who has been so generous with his time over the years and encouragement, and at the same time thank his family who shares him with us. Senator Winfield was an activist, still is, long before he joined the legislature. He began his journey with us, OSJ's continuing educational series, in January 2021. So yes, we are entering our fourth year. Senator Winfield is the Senate chair here in Connecticut of the Judiciary Committee, and he knows how important it is to get the facts out about this difficult and emotional topic, and public education is key. All of our webinars have been recorded except for last week's at the speaker's request, and all supporting documents, including PowerPoints, papers, and studies, are provided on our website. We are missing this season Dr. Danielle Cooper from the University of New Haven and Tau Youth Justice, who added her savvy and brilliance to this program. Danielle is on sabbatical, and we are looking forward to her return. I'm delighted to have Dr. Alissa Ackerman, Gretchen Casey, and Philip Casey with us tonight. Alissa and Philip worked together at the Vicarious RJ conference OSJ put on along with Dr. Ackerman in April 2019 in Hartford. These are amazing individuals who just keep on giving, and we extend heartfelt thank yous to them. This is the format. Alissa and Gretchen will speak about their work. Then we will have storytelling. I'll wrap up the presentation part with 2 questions to all of our panelists before opening it up to you. Before I go on to my last point, I'd be remiss if I didn't share with you the documentary, A Case for Love, has been released today, January 23rd. In a time of national chaos and lack of unity, watch as this film team searches for people living their lives selflessly. Can love heal? Someone I know has been going through a hard time lately. I asked him to express his feelings through writing whatever comes to his mind. The following excerpt speaks volumes. He was incarcerated, returned to his community approximately a year ago, and is struggling with community supervision and predatory employment practices. He would also say he survived the halfway house if he was here. Instead, hear his voice. Sometimes I feel all alone in a desert of darkness. Dry and bewildered, I'm a ghost, a transparent human walking right through the flesh wound prick of cactus arms, saying with pointed pain, "This is insane." I can feel the wet coyote nose of anxiety rubbing against my paranoia, sniffing my footprints, following my hurt shadow, breathing in my cologne of fear, rearing its canine head to the emergence to pounce on my torso of insecurity. In the dark, I'm attacked from behind and bitten on the shoulder blade. My neck is twisted with resistance from the watermark horror of not knowing why I deserve to be so alone. Unable to see, I push my hands out into the jaws of despair, growling, taking me down into the sand of trauma. There is nothing out here but loneliness. Like no one is alive, like I never existed, like I've been here all by myself since I've been born. Every part of my spirit has been bitten, swallowed, regurgitated, and eaten again. I'm an enemy of the state of well-being left to die in the open air for all of us to see, but no one sees me. Let's just pause a moment. That is so hard to read because his suffering is palpable. Without restorative practices, too many people suffer and our communities are less safe. Robert's story, we're using a pseudonym to protect him, is just one side of the coin of suffering. If crime hurts, then justice should heal. Let's see what Gretchen and Alissa have to say. Thank you so much.
Sure. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gretchen Casey, and I live and work in Florida. And I have created something called the Amend Initiative in 2019. I'll tell you a little bit more about what I did that led up to starting and the Amend Initiative, but it's got a Facebook and a social media presence. But really, what I'm doing is specializing in a very particular space where restorative justice and what is often called victim offender dialogues take place. And that is primarily in Florida. And it is in cases there where there has been severe threat or severe harm. So I primarily work in cases that involve death penalty or homicide or DUI manslaughter. Sexual harm is an area of great interest to me. And I also work in cases where there is someone has reported a crime and the case is still pending. That is, these are not cases that have already been disposed or resolved, but cases where there is someone who reaches out to me to indicate that they are interested in the possibility or the option of restorative justice and want to learn about it, consider it, and then participate in it. So in probably the last 7 years, I've had the chance or been asked to be involved with about maybe 120, 125 cases. And I've also had the chance to do a lot of training for facilitators. I offer a week-long training in Gainesville, Florida. It's a residential training, and it's limited to about 6 people because I believe that this work of being a facilitator takes a lot of practice, and that you learn best when you're with a small group of people who are very, very invested and really are curious about and interested in becoming facilitators in the types of cases that I work in. This is not to take away anything from the amazing work that's being done in schools and with juveniles, but I just wanted to let you all know that sort of my focus and my practice specializes in primarily adults and adult people who've been charged or adult people who have received some sort of harm. I also have been the past president of the Florida Restorative Justice Association, and it's been around since about 2013. So I think we've just celebrated our 10th year of existence. And one of the exciting things that was offered to me was the chance to be involved with developing some guidelines for facilitators and guidelines for facilitator training. So that has been something that was a 2-year long process of not only researching what other states have been doing, but really figuring out what do we want to offer in Florida. So it's been a real opportunity to really get involved in a number of issues affecting what we're going to be able to look at and offer in the state of Florida. One of the things that's been also really exciting and in some ways a new challenge for me, because I had not been involved in victim advocacy and legislative bill support since the 1990s and 2000, is that here it is in 2023, and I've been involved with seeking House and Senate sponsors in Florida to pass a restorative justice bill. And the bill is about making the option of restorative justice a right for victims to pursue. So we wanted to put that in the victims' rights statute. And also making the opportunity to receive training on reparative behavior accountability under the sort of umbrella of restorative justice as something that any individual who's incarcerated would have access to. So it's a two-part bill. 2023, we did not get a chance to be heard in committee. And it looks like now, as of probably Monday or Tuesday, we will probably find out it will not get heard in this legislative session either. So we're going to keep going. We're going to come back. We're going to be like a mosquito and just remind people that we're not going away. And so just wanted to sort of give you some flavor of the work that I've done in Florida and how excited I am to join you tonight along with a panel of all these distinguished speakers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alissa.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. It's really wonderful to be here with Gretchen and Phil and Senator Winfield and Cindy, people who I respect so much in this field. I am the owner and co-founder of Ampersands Restorative Justice, and I'm also a professor of criminal justice at California State University at Fullerton, where I specialize in the study of sexual violence prevention, post-conviction policy, and restorative justice for cases of sexual harm. And when I started Ampersands Restorative Justice several years ago, the goal that I had was to bring restorative justice to scale, to really make this a viable option for people who were harmed sexually and people who had authored sexual harm. And a testament to that, I just want to do a couple of shout outs tonight, is to see the community in which I am embedded here. There are people who have been trained at Ampersands Restorative Justice. There are people who I have taught in restorative justice courses at the University of San Diego. My mentor and friend, Dr. Jill Levinson, is here. And so many other people who are building community, who are becoming part of community, where restorative justice really is an option. And years ago, when I came to this work, it didn't seem like there were that many options. And to see that growing because of the people that are here tonight is really wonderful. So when I first started this work, facilitating cases, I was mostly facilitating direct one-on-one cases or vicarious restorative justice cases of sexual harm. And that's why I started Ampersands Restorative Justice, to have an organization that could handle those cases. And since we last spoke a year ago when I was on this webinar, things have sort of shifted a little bit. So the cases that I'm seeing now are not one-on-one direct cases, although those do come through Ampersands, and I tend to pass those to other facilitators. But the cases that are, the ones that I'm facilitating, the ones that I'm most interested right now are actually institutional cases. So they're not necessarily cases of primary sexual harm. They're cases of secondary harm where an institution didn't respond appropriately to a disclosure or allowed behaviors to occur within the organization. And survivors are now coming forward and saying it's that harm, it's that institutional betrayal, a term from Dr. Jennifer Fry out of the University of Oregon and the Center for Institutional Courage. It's the institutional betrayal that they would like restorative processes for. And in fact, the literature shows that when somebody experiences sexual harm, when it happens within an institution and the institution betrays that survivor, the impacts of that primary harm are actually worse. And so the cases that I'm seeing right now are mostly religious institutions or denominations. So leaders from the denomination or a church or a synagogue are coming to the table and saying, we want to be accountable. We want to be responsible for the secondary harm that we've caused. I'm just finishing a 18-month facilitation right now with 26 survivors in a large Jewish denomination. And so those are the kinds of cases that I'm finding just to be so rewarding to be a part of right now. Hearing institutional leaders take responsibility during and then after restorative processes with survivors, and then making long-term change within the organization has really been powerful to be a part of. I'm also doing a lot of consulting work on what restorative justice could look like within an institution. And then, of course, we do training at Ampersands Restorative Justice to train new facilitators specifically for cases of sexual harm. This year, I finally had the opportunity to go into the California prisons to work with people who were convicted of a sexual offense. And I hope that that work continues in 2024, so specifically restorative justice work with that population. And so while again, the work started with these individual one-on-one cases, and I still love those cases. I'm finding so much joy these days in these larger cases where institutional harm has occurred. And I think that that's probably where my work will focus, and the cases that Ampersands is directly taking, where we will focus in the next year. And then, hoping to build our training program out more fully. So that's kind of the work that Ampersands has been up to, and I will turn it to Cindy.
We just wanted to start the conversation with sort of an update about what Gretchen and Alissa have been working on over the past 12 to 20 months or so. And now we're going to go into some storytelling, and we're going to start with Philip Kaso.
Well, good evening, everybody. As Cindy said, my name is Philip Kaso, and I'm really happy to be here tonight with these distinguished panelists and with all of you. I'm happy to share a little bit of my story and background, a little bit of where I'm at, and then I'll tell you kind of how I got here through the years. So I am currently a director on the NARSOL board. A director and a treasurer for the NARSOL board, and I am also a director and vice president on NARSOL's foundation, Vivante Aspero, and I've been working with both of those organizations for it's been about the last 10 years now. I identify as both a victim and an abuser, although I technically really don't like the term victim, but my story started, back in the 60s. I was born in '62 in North Carolina, and I had a family there was a total of 8 brothers and sisters, 4 boys, 4 girls. And my grandmother who lived with us said there was, 11 people in the house. It was a very full house. And from the outside, by all intents and purposes, it seemed like to be your normal, happy family. But on the inside of that family was serious rot. I don't have all the evidence, nor do I ever want to really try to go back and get all the evidence, but I'm pretty sure that almost all of the kids, if not all of them, were involved in different types of incestuous relationships between siblings, including not my mother, but my father was involved in some of those relationships as well. Father was an alcoholic and verbal and physical abuser as well. So my life started off pretty hectic. I like to tell people my first love in life was actually my 4 years older brother. And that's really kind of how I was framed and sexualized at approximately the age of 10 years old. And that's when my abuse started, but I never really recognized it as abuse then. At one point in our childhood, a couple scenarios, a couple situations came up, and it kind of leaked out a bit that something was going on, but it was quickly buried. There was a lot of punishment that went involved in the family, but it was really quickly buried, and no one was ever afforded any kind of opportunity, any kind of counseling, or really anything. So what we learned wasn't, we didn't actually get any help for what we did. And so I've always told people, abusers don't wake up one morning and go, hey, I want to be an abuser today. I think I'll go out and abuse somebody. In my experience, a significant portion, probably 90+% of people who abuse are those who were abused in one fashion or another, and are hurt and have not healed and go on to hurt other people. And so without being afforded the opportunity to heal or get that kind of counseling when you're younger, you end up turning back around and doing. So I fast forward to, I spent 20 years in the Navy after I got out of high school. And right as I was retiring, my daughter, who happens to be my victim, came forward. This was approximately 23 years ago. She came forward and let one of her teachers know that I had been inappropriate with her for approximately 5 years. And that instantly blew up my entire family. Although one could argue it was pretty dysfunctional before that, but it really tore the family apart. And no matter what my daughter felt or how she might have wanted to do something other than just destroy the family, that was basically the only option she was given at the time. Restorative justice may have been something back then, but I had never heard of it. But for me, from my perspective, I thought it was the greatest thing that ever happened because it was a turning point for me. My daughter had finally set me free. I could come out of the shadows. I could, take responsibility, admit that, what I had done and how I had harmed, and try to recover. And in order to do that, it was going to take a lot of work on my part. I was happy and lucky to have a very supportive family. My wife has been with me the entire time. We'll be married for 35 years this coming summer. I've got a 27-year-old son, and my daughter is still with us, and I have 2 grandkids. They both live, or all 3 of them live down in Virginia Beach. And my daughter and my mother, we all have worked through the years, and it's like I said, it's been about 20 years. We've worked through the years and have gone through lots of therapy, both individually and together, and have focused on the opportunity for all of us to heal and all of us to find a path forward, and not just one person has an opportunity to heal and the other side of the equation has to be damned for the rest of their life. As many people that I know would attest to, child protective services, parole and probation, the prison systems, the justice system, none of them are set up to really do anything other than punishment. It's punishment and that's it. There really isn't any other method or any other light. And I get that it's a double-edged sword and it's a challenge, especially for minors. Offering a 11, 12, 13-year-old the opportunity to do something other than, traditional justice is a challenge because they're already pressured. They're already totally out of their element at that point because they've come forward. So it's definitely something that's challenging. It certainly would work much better, I think, in my opinion, for someone who's already a mature adult, looking back, discovering, abuse, and wants to confront that now with, an estranged person in their family. But needless to say, it can work, and there can be opportunities for it to work. But what I would like to see is that the social services, at a minimum, would be set up to support families who identify and, make kids safe, make people safe, but support families who identify that they want to try and heal and stay together, and support them in that process of restoring and healing. So it's 23 years after my daughter came forward, and I'm happy to say that I have a full life. I have a great job. I'm getting ready to retire in another year or so. And my wife and my son and my daughter and my 2 new grandkids are all together. And we're like any other humans. We have our good days and our bad days, but at least we're doing it together. So that's a bit of my story. Thank you. I appreciate you letting me share.
Philip, if I were to ask you just one question right now, when you said it set you free, and then I imagine you started learning, right, about the family dynamic and what happened. What did you learn anything that was like especially surprising to you about the family dynamic and the inter?
I'd always been very analytic and always caught in deep thought about things and looking at systemic issues and processes. And so when I said it set me free, it was, I didn't have to hide anymore. You know, I was outed, whether I wanted to be or not. I was outed and I had a choice. I could deny, or I could, go in both feet and just, admit everything that was going on and try as best I could to get help and to recover, and for the rest of my family to recover. There were lots of things that, as you go through the years, the different nuances, but there's anything that really sticks out as that, like, wow, that was just like totally an aha moment.
Can I ask you if you know how many generations it went back, or you didn't go there?
I didn't go there. I don't think it went past this generation, but I'm not absolutely sure. So at 2 generations at least, mine, and then my family, extended family, and some of my other siblings' family. But no one in our family ever got help, and no one has still got help except for what they've done for themselves, basically. I don't have any good evidence that any of my other siblings have ever got any help, but that doesn't mean that they haven't.
Thank you so much for telling us your story and putting yourself out there and being vulnerable. You used an acronym though, NARSOL. Would you tell us what that stands for, please?
NARSOL is the National Association for Rational Sexual Offense Laws. That's a mouthful. And Vivante Aspero is a Spanish term. Don't ask me what the real Spanish term is anymore, but that's NARSOL's 501c3 foundation.
Thank you.
I don't think I used any other acronyms.
No, you did not.
I've been out of the Navy now long enough that I don't use them too much.
All right, we'll come back to you again. We're going to go now to Gretchen, who will tell us some of her story and how she got here.
Well, in 1984, when I was 23 years old, I was studying and finishing up a degree in urban planning. And I was working for the city planning department. And this has been something I've always wanted to do. My mom was involved in local politics and she was a city planner. And I was just really interested in housing and in all these systems that have to come together to collectively as well as individually provide things like housing and parks. And I was always really interested in who's left out and who's welcome in city or community spaces. So I've always been someone that was really, really intrigued by just how do we make cities safer places for people to live and to feel safe and comfortable in. And like many people my age, I had never experienced anything like sexual assault, or if I had friends that had, we certainly weren't talking about it. This was in the early 80s. And one night I came home and I was asleep and someone broke into my apartment where I was living. my roommate wasn't there, and I was, and again, I want to say, if this is triggering for anyone, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I was blindfolded and gagged and tied up, and the person had a knife. And I was so in shock when this happened that I just could not believe it was happening. I just could not believe what was taking place. I was in such, I was in, I just couldn't even understand it. And I went from, I can't believe this is happening, to, I have to do whatever I have to do to survive this, because my mom cannot receive a phone call from the Gainesville Police Department telling her that I've been killed. I could not, that's all that mattered to me, was I just had to prevent my mom from receiving a phone call like that. And so when everything was all finished, the individual, who was a stranger to me, I had never met him, never seen him before in my life, said that if I reported it to the police, he would come back and he would kill me the next day. So I thought that was a pretty good bet, that if I didn't tell anyone, then he wouldn't come back. And I thought that I'm willing to do that. So he said it was gonna take him about 10 minutes to leave, and then I was not to get up or do anything, and so I didn't. And I was just so glad that other than a small cut on my hand, very small, minor, didn't need stitches or anything, nothing like that. I was just so relieved that he was going to leave. So I drove over to my then boyfriend, who became my husband, but I went over to my then boyfriend's house, and I was pretty hysterical. And he said, "What's wrong? What happened?" And I said, someone broke into my house. And he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And I decided then I didn't go to sleep this happened at like 3 a.m. I didn't go to sleep, but I also knew I couldn't go to work the next day or two, because I could never ever go back to that apartment. And I didn't know how I was going to tell the apartment manager that I had to move out. So I think I was just in a lot of, if I look back now, I know I was in shock. So what happened was, when I told the apartment manager I needed to move out, I was crying the next day. And she said, "Were you raped? Did someone rape you? What happened?" And I couldn't say the word. And so she called a rape crisis program. They came out, and I explained that I couldn't tell because he would come back and kill me. And I had beautiful and amazing victim advocates that sat with me through the rape exam. But in Florida in 1984, we didn't have a victims' rights statute. So I didn't have the right to be notified or present or heard. And so when the person was ultimately caught, this individual was a complete stranger to me. And he was charged with 4 cases of sexual battery. Myself, 2 other women, and a young man. And so for me, the only thing that mattered was that I was alive. That's all that mattered, is I had lived through it. I moved, I kept going to school. I didn't want anyone to know what had happened to me. I was really, really terrified, but I was also really embarrassed and humiliated by what had been done and said to me. And I didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't want anybody. I didn't even tell my boyfriend. When a police article came out that reported the sexual crime, they did not identify my name. So I was just waiting for the person to get caught. And when they got caught, they ultimately, because they had committed a crime like this before and they had been let out, they'd received a life sentence, but they were let out after serving 8 years. And I will say this, I don't believe this individual ever got any help at all while he was serving time in prison. He commits these 4 new crimes and they re-sentence him to his full life sentence. And I will tell you that to this day, he is still in the Department of Corrections. And that's been, 40 years. So what happened was I quit my job in city planning because I I felt like as much as I loved the job, I needed to give something back because of all this amazing support I received from the Rape and Crime Victim Advocate Program. And so I started, I went to every support group. I went to a lot of individual counseling, and I decided I wanted to be a victim advocate, but not for sexual battery cases, for more like homicide and drunk driving and death cases. And the reason for that, and I'll tell you this, is because I didn't want to identify as a sexual assault survivor. But what I could identify with is the belief that I thought I was going to be killed, and that I could relate to maybe what someone who believed the threat was going to turn into an act of harm. I could relate to how much I was thinking about my parents, and I just didn't want them to hurt. That my final thoughts when I thought a knife was going to be used to really, really hurt or kill me was all I was thinking about was my mom and my dad. So I know that may sound kind of disjointed or whatever, but what happened for me was I just started going to every single national conference, in-house training. I started reading books. I started to really follow the victims' rights movement because it was starting to pick up in the 1980s. And then in 1989, I met this woman named Suzanne Mulhan, and she had had a victim offender dialogue with the man who had killed her son. And that to me was just, it was like this, like, that's possible? That there'd be an opportunity to be able to speak to this person who caused this sadness and harm to me, that maybe one day it could happen for me. So I started going to NAVAC at the time. No, I'm sorry, it was called NAVSPIC, the National Association of Victim Services in Prisons, and for victim advocates who work in prisons. And I was just so touched and so affected by the stories that people were saying, that much like Philip said, the gift of what it means to be able to speak with and speak to and ask questions. And because I was so interested in it, I started to notice that while nobody was asking for something called a victim offender dialogue, I kept noticing all the people that I would work with as a victim advocate, first in a rape crisis program, then as a crisis responder to do death notifications. And then ultimately, I went on to become the Director of Victim Services for the 8th Judicial Circuit in Alachua County. And I was able to do a lot of training and a lot of public speaking, and a lot of awareness started to really grow around both individual accountability and collective accountability. I was hearing people express so much frustration with the state attorney's office or the police departments, or I was hearing people, again, not ask for restorative justice, but ask for the chance to, when do I get to ask a question? I want to find out who they are now, or I want to find out who their parents are. I want to know if anybody in this family is sorry for what happened to me or my family. So one of the things that became really interesting to me was to find out and hear from people that would say, Gretchen, you're my victim advocate. Will you come with me to the jail? My sister-in-law is charged with murdering my brother. Would you come with me as my victim advocate just so I can talk to them? And I don't know about you, but I learned as a victim advocate, sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And so I would go and I would sit with people, and I could see what could happen when people who wanted to talk were given the opportunity. So from that, when I started the Amend initiative, I was really, really interested in figuring out, where is there discomfort or concern or questions or disbelief or simply unfamiliarity, that this process, this opportunity to invite both people who've been harmed and someone who's responsible for harm, how could we make this an option for more people? And I will tell you that I think I mentioned I was 23 when this happened. 23 years later, I did go to the Department of Corrections and I asked for a restorative justice, or we call them victim offender dialogues in Florida at that time. And initially, although I didn't ask him directly, the Department of Corrections asked the individual responsible for the sexual battery if he would be willing to speak to me. And to make a very long story short, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. He said yes. And then 2 days later, the warden called up and said, he's not going to speak to you. He won't, he's been advised not to ever speak to anyone about this case. And so it will not happen. And I was devastated because what the thing that it did to me was it made me believe, like, once again, he's in control of whether or not this happens, not me. I mean, I asked for it, but ultimately, if he says no, then, you know, unless a surrogate is used, I don't get this opportunity. So for me, I did the next best thing, and I wrote a screenplay about what would have happened if we had had a chance to meet. And that screenplay ended up getting turned into a film, a small short film. It's only like 45 minutes long. It's about what would have happened if we had met. And it's called Somewhere Beyond. And many of you may recognize that from the quote by Rumi, somewhere beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing is a field. I'll meet you there. And it's always been my fondest wish to have a meeting. But after writing the screenplay, I kind of let go of that and decided if it never happens, I'm okay. I wrote what I had hoped would have happened. So one of the things that sort of brought me to just continually gaining more awareness of why this is so important is I had a chance to interview 500 felons, individuals who had been charged with and convicted of felons who were either in prison or on probation. And I devised a 4-question survey. And the survey said, first of all, have you ever heard of restorative justice? Yes or no? And then I gave a definition of restorative justice. And I said, and I asked people, if this was available to you, whether you're on probation or in the Department of Corrections serving time, would you be interested in participating with the person who is the identified as the victim in your crime? Now, I did not ask what if it was your family member or someone else who may have also been impacted by you being, you know, in prison. I didn't ask that question, but it asked specifically, would you be interested in speaking with the victim? And the third question was, would you please describe or define the type of crime that you've committed? And the fourth question is, would you please describe your relationship to the person who was harmed? So I got a little over 500 answers to this, and we published a paper on defendant awareness and interest in participating in restorative justice. And if you're interested, I'll send it and share it with Cindy. It's only 8 pages long. It's a really brief read. And it just talks about the amazing interest there is by people who have caused harm and are now perhaps really interested in doing something that may give something back to someone in terms of answers or the ability to face and look at the impact or begin to understand the impact. And I think that this is a really important thing because the longer I was in the criminal justice system, the longer I felt that it was important that after you do the worst thing or the hard thing or the difficult thing that has, you know, some act of wrongdoing or misinformation or misunderstanding or unintentional harm that takes place, I think it's really important that we individually and collectively say, we want to invite you to do now the right thing or the next best thing. And I don't think we do that enough in the criminal justice system. And so I share all this with you because my life and my sort of interests have meandered in many, many different ways and places. And it's really, really wonderful to join you tonight, especially with the types of experiences each of us have and that you're going to hear about. And with that, I'm going to stop now so that the next speaker can speak. Thank you.
Gretchen, thank you so much. I met Gretchen, it'll be 2 years this coming June or July in Chicago at a National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. And I heard her story and I went up to her afterwards and, you know, I had participated in the session, so she knew the community I followed and served. And I went over to Gretchen and do you remember what I said to you? I said, you probably won't want to talk to me. And she said, you're exactly who I want to talk to. So, and that started the relationship. So thank you so much, Gretchen, for being who you are and your optimism and your hope, quite frankly. So thank you. I'm going to move on to Senator Gary Winfield.
Thank you. Good evening. Cindy asked me to talk about my story, which I've talked about a little bit in the past. Gary Winfield, state senator here in Connecticut, represent the 10th district. Before that, I was in the House, and I made it to somewhere in the middle of my 30s before I ever talked about my situation, really, except to my ex-wife, and I don't really think she kind of was able to deal with that. But one day we were dealing with issues in the Catholic Church and the issue of statute of limitations, and the way that things work, people come before us and they're testifying, and legislators are sitting there engaging with them, and what happens is there's a question and answer, and as this question and answer is going on, the representatives of the church are kind of laughing at the folks who have been victimized. And I always scan the room to see how people are responding. And as I'm scanning the room, I'm observing people who are clearly disturbed by what's happening. And then at one point, one of the representatives kind of leans back in his seat and laughs at how preposterous he thinks it is that someone would hold this information and not tell it for 20, 30 years or longer. And I'm sitting there as a person who's held information for that kind of time. And now I'm kind of faced with, like, I've never talked about this, right? But I'm in a position of power, and I'm faced with looking at these people who, maybe because I've been through something similar, I can tell are disturbed, and I don't know what to do. So I'm struggling with this, and this just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and it's dismissive. And finally, I just kind of have no choice, but I let out that, I've been through. And that turned into this whole thing because it's the first time and it happened in that way. It was very emotional for me, and it was all of the stuff, right, including an inability to really articulate myself well, tears, all of the stuff you would imagine it to be. And because I happened to be in the position I was in, people paid attention. And it stopped the hearing. We got the hearing back on track. And then the next day I was visited by some officials from the church, and there were apologies and all kinds of stuff. But what happened was, at that point, I guess it was about 20 plus years, I don't know, 20 plus years. Now it's about 40 years. Prior, I was a young kid who was left with someone, and multiple times that person took advantage of the situation. And I don't know what I would have said in those moments about what I needed, but I know that I never felt like I needed someone to come swoop in and, like, put this person behind bars and all of the stuff that we normally do. I needed help for myself in a different way. And what I've, I guess, learned over the years in my activism, which has included all kinds of populations of folks who people don't really pay attention to or don't assess in a way that is what I think is correct, is that each individual situation is an individual situation. The people who we tend to refer to as victims aren't all the same, and the people who we tend to refer to as perpetrators aren't always the same. And we should think about having a system that deals with all of the complexities. For me, I didn't tell because I was confused, and help would have helped me. The woman that acted upon me, it turns out, is very much like, in terms of what she looked like and all of that stuff, like the woman I have a preference for. And so even though I was a little child, and I know now, right, that I didn't have control over that situation, I wondered to myself, well, did I want that to happen? All of the stuff that you hear about, the traditional system doesn't do anything about that. I also felt like my mother, had entrusted me to this person, and this happened, and I felt some sense of needing to protect her. It's not really my place, but the traditional system doesn't deal with that. And so I just know that we have developed systems that say that they speak for people who, again, we tend to refer to as victims, but they don't necessarily. And so when I'm engaged in a legislative process, Cindy and I interact with one another in a very similar way to what Cindy just said. She's looking for legislators to come and engage with her population, and there's a sort of assumption that, she didn't know my story, but assumption that legislators aren't going to come. And I went because I was very interested in the population, and because I know that the stories we tell about the population she deals with are not accurate. And because I know that the stories we tell about the population of those who've experienced harm are not accurate, and all of it means that we're not necessarily creating a space of safety in the way that we say that we are. And so for the last few years, I've been engaged in this work with Cindy as an additional front on the activism that I'm doing. And it's not easy work as a legislator. People always wanting to know why you want to help those people. But the reason why I want to make sure that we know who we're talking about, if there's two sides to this line, both sides, is because I don't think that we get to real safety for people when we speak for them and don't listen to their stories and understand the complexities that are involved in those things. So, Cindy often says that she's thankful that I'll come out, and she apologizes, but I think the work is important. And there are not enough people in positions where they can help to elevate the conversation and get us to a place where we have understanding, so that we can have the right policies in place and actually make people safer. So there's never a need for apology. It's work that needs to be done, and I'm happy to be doing it.
So Gary, I was supposed to look through days, if not weeks, of the Senate debates, right? For the video clip of you responding to legislators who feel the need to speak for all victims.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've sort of had my eye on, and it's because of a documentary or two that surfaced this summer, is that victims seem to be coming forward and saying, thanks for loaning us your voice, we got this. And so I wanted to ask you, what did you say that day on the Senate floor?
Yeah, so I wasn't talking about this particular population, but in many ways we treat people who are those who've experienced harm the same way, right? You have the politicians jump in front of a camera and start saying what they think. And there was this whole conversation around people who had had their cars stolen and some other crimes. And as I was listening to it, the conversation developed, I was just getting more and more frustrated. So I grew up in a place where the harm I just described is not the only thing that ever happened to me. Far from it. And like many of the people who grew up where I grew up, much of it we just kind of came to expect it was going to happen, right? So it's like I got up in the morning, I'm going to school, the family car is gone. That really sucked. And we just kept moving because it's something that had happened before. We knew it would happen again. Or I would get up and like the television in the house was gone. It kind of sucks, but you just keep moving on, right? Not a normal response, but it's what happened. I talked about, I described all the stuff, and then I said what I think you think was the most important. I talked about how even though I have the position I have now, the neighborhood I live in, gunshots are not unfamiliar to me, and even my little 6-year-olds know exactly what to do. And then we just all move on, right? There's no like, let's really reflect upon it. We just move on because there's an expectation that in our life some certain things happen. And what was happening on the part of the legislators who were there was there's this whole thing about whether or not car thefts were increasing, and people were so outraged, and it was the biggest thing. And not that it's not a big thing, but I was trying to express to them that there's some folks for whom harm is an expectation. Should not be, but it's an expectation. And then there are other folks for whom the one time that harm may visit someone in their community, it means the whole legislature has to stop, the whole world has to stop, and we have to respond to it. And I was pointing out that, like, when you say that you speak for victims, that's their language. When you say that you speak for victims, why is it that you never speak for these folks over here? And the reason why I was pointing that out is because oftentimes those folks don't agree with what's being said. And so those folks get ignored. And I was pointing out that it just is part of the way that we decide who matters, right? Like which people matter based on where they live, the economy, race, and all of that stuff.
Yes.
And how we politicize the thing that we say that we're doing in such a way as to actually, I think, cause more harm. So that's a lot of words in my mouth. Sorry about that. But that was what I was trying to get at, that even when we say we're trying to help people, that's not it. It has nothing to do with helping people. It has to do with trying to use those people to advance whatever policy we're trying to put forward.
So, Gary, let's stay with you for one more question. The theme of tonight's call was supposed to be honoring all victims. And so, a year or two ago, I started developing a chart of all the harms, collateral consequences coming to so many people in the community and the different families, those who are falsely accused. We have one family, a colleague of mine, whose son was on the registry, and of course, he left us too soon. He passed on because of the onerous systems. But his younger brother was also accused, and his younger brother saw the onerous system of parole and probation and what was going on with his brother. Long story short, the charges got dropped, or the charges never came. The investigation went nowhere. So he was set free, but he was so traumatized by what could have been that as a 40-year-old man, he still doesn't date. He's petrified. He saw what his brother went through. I've got some men on the call tonight that you've met in the Judiciary public hearing, and a few you haven't met yet. And they're still fighting their cases as innocent men, because we do know people are convicted rightfully and wrongfully. And so the people that are going to prison as innocent men are also sort of victims of this. So I wanted to just ask you, what is your thoughts on when we say honoring all victims?
Well, I mean, to me, it goes to the point I was just making, right? If you are speaking for folks and not listening to them, whether they be a victim of a system that's wrongfully convicted them, whether they be a person who has actually experienced harm and processes it in one way or the other, you're doing harm. We're doing harm, right? And I don't think that means that you completely eliminate some form of punishment, right? Because I think that's what happens. I think people, when they hear that you want to have a restorative form of justice, when you want to have services for people and all the stuff that we talk about, right? The panoply of things that we talk about. I think what they're hearing is all they want to do is come in here and set everybody free, right? And I don't know about anybody else, but that's not quite a descriptor of what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do is have a system that actually listens and recognizes that some people do not need nor want that stuff. Some people need something else, and if you're a person who's concerned, at least ostensibly, about victims, then you would listen to what they have to say and what they need. But our system does not do that. Our system says, we know what you need, we'll give it to you, no matter how good or bad it is for you. And oftentimes people are left going, that's all. And sometimes people are left feeling really good in the moment of it, right? Like the system got that person. And later they discover that what they thought was good for them wasn't. And all of that is because we've come with a understanding of who is a victim, who's not, who deserves to be heard, and who doesn't. And I don't think it's any good. And there was a question, I'll just jump in on the question. There was a question about the registry. I think registries feel like they are the proper response. But I don't think when you have a registry, you necessarily know what you think you know. And I think a lot of damage is done by the way that we have had registries. We talked about different spaces where people effectively can't live anywhere and all of the stuff. But even if they were still able to live in those spaces, what they're able to do and how they're able to move, because we have assumptions based on the fact that they're on that registry. And again, we don't necessarily know everything we think. I think it's dangerous for society. So I just wanted to not run away from that question because I saw it in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. So please leave your video on. If everybody could turn their video on, Dr. Ackerman, I'm going to you next. Oh, there you are. You just jumped around the screen. What does honoring all victims mean to you?
I mean, I think I echo what Senator Winfield said. It's listening to what people need. It's recognizing that all of us have experienced harm and all of us have caused harm. And this, you know, I talk about the name Ampersands Restorative Justice. What that means is there's not us and them. It means we're all capable of being held in the same conversation, in the same legislation, in the same community, but it requires us to really listen to everybody. You know, we tend to think of these things as really easy. They're not. These are complex situations, complex, you know, Phil talked about like a dysfunctional family. That's not a simple thing. Like there's a lot of complexity there and we have to honor that complexity. We don't get there without listening to one another.
So I'm going to do something, and Sammy, I don't know if you can help me. Carol Boggs is on the phone. I'm sorry, Carol, I just probably outed you. I don't know if you want to either restate your question. Last week with Kelly Sosha, Gary, I think Carol was starting to have some conflict in terms of what does justice look like for the person who harmed and for the person who was harmed. And that also is a very complex question. So I was hoping, Alissa, why don't we start with you on that? What does justice look like for the person who was harmed?
I think it looks different to different people who have experienced harm. And that's I mean, so I don't think that restorative justice is for everybody, but I do think that restorative justice allows us to be really creative and allows us to get to the needs that different people have in a way that the traditional criminal legal process doesn't allow for. So I don't think there's one definition of justice, and I don't think that for each person there's one definition of justice. There's this great term, some researchers from, I believe the UK came up with, I'm not even going to try to put their names out there right now. I can get you all the article if you want, but it is called Kaleidoscopic Justice. And it's this idea that, you know, you think about a kaleidoscope and how you turn it and the colors change. Well, that's what justice is like for those of us who've experienced harm. It changes sometimes depending on the day, sometimes depending on the hour. So it's not just one thing, and that's why we have to really listen.
So I think Sam is going to try to give Carol Boggs a voice. We're going to hear from Carol. Carol, you're muted.
Hello.
Hi, did I go to school with you at Stop It Now?
Don't believe so.
Okay, it might have been one of your colleagues. Okay, sorry.
That's okay. As an advocate, you know, some of the things that I've been doing this work for the last 7 years, and so I was hearing new things last week. But as far as restorative justice, I think again, it does look certainly different to every person, you know, obviously. I know that the satisfaction is not in the court systems. We know that for sure. Rarely. And I think it's just about how do we find, I don't know that there are answers. I don't know that I'm, you know, have any words of wisdom at all, other than that I know it definitely looks different for all folks. Certainly there's the court system in itself, it can be extremely damaging for victims, you know. I don't know what the answer is, certainly.
Can I ask what age victims you work with? Are the children or?
Most of the people so I'm an adult advocate, but we certainly, I worked with a mom who had a child that was her foster child, actually, who she ended up adopting, but she was only 4. And at 7, you know, mom said, we need to be done with this. This needs to be completed in a way that she doesn't have to go through this anymore and have questions and, you know, that kind of thing. So every family's different, you know, every family's different. Mostly I work with adults. I will say that last year, of course, COVID, you know, shut everything down. So the first case after 6 years, the first case I ever had in a court system was last spring.
Okay,
That's how slowly those wheels turn, you know.
So Gary, part of, you know, you're in Judiciary Committee, how many years now? Now you're the Senate Chair.
I've been on the committee 15 years. 15.
And so, you know, certainly from other committees, we hear about they want to raise the punishment, enhance the punishment, get people off the streets if you molest a child, send them to prison forever until they die or rot. Does punishment deter crime?
I mean, we know that the way that we think about punishment deterring crime, it doesn't. And I'm not going to say that there aren't people for whom some of the forms of punishment we use aren't what we need to do with them. I think to go to the what was just put forward, right? About I don't know what we should do here. I think what we should do is stop assuming that we know what should happen. In terms of a one size fits all. And I think that's really the problem. So when human beings who are all different come into a space and experience something, treating them as if one answer is the solution is problematic. And so I think we need a system that has various ways of dealing with things. And when you talk about justice, at the very least, you have to consider the folks whose realities have met. And when you don't do that, you're not trying to do justice. You're trying to do some other thing, right? And so for me, what I am hoping to see is not the nonsense that we do where we're always trying to enhance penalties, even though we know that that's not going to deter folks, right? I mean, look, you can look at different states with harsher penalties. They still have all of the crimes that happen here in this state. What I am trying to do is get us to a place where we know better, right? Because we've done things like this forum and the other forums that I've been involved in. And then we do better by doing things, unlearning the bad habits that we've developed. And that's really the core of the work, learning enough that we can then do better.
All right, Gretchen, honoring all victims. What say you? What comes to your mind?
Well, I do think we not only do we, is it important to recognize that each and every person that we come in contact with on either side of a conflict has needs, but that I am absolutely convinced that people can evolve and their needs and it can change. And that when we have that awareness, it points to this thing, and I'm going to quote Martin Luther King simply because I think this is one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. And that is, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. And I think that when we treat people who have made mistakes, some of them very tragic mistakes, and all we feel is contempt for them, and we just want to push them away, and we don't care what happens to them in prisons, and we don't want to fund rehabilitation, then let's not be too surprised if individuals who come out of prison don't feel supported, they don't feel like there's safe housing, that there's a means to be able to ever repay the fines or the fees, then we are just constantly being part, and this is where this thing about individual and collective responsibility is huge for me. We cannot blame people on their individual accountability if we also don't look at the collective accountability of whether it's laws, whether it's how prisons are run, or how when we've had law enforcement officers who break the very same laws and get treated differently. And I'm not saying with a broad brush, obviously I'm not saying all law enforcement officers are bad. Of course not, that's not true. But I think that if we're really interested in justice, I think it's going to have to not only ask people what is justice, and sometimes you don't know in the beginning. Sometimes you're not sure. It depends on the circumstances. But I think that for too long, the criminal justice system has just focused on, all right, what are the scoring guidelines that what is the sentencing ranges we're going to look at? Let's move this case on. Let's resolve these cases. And my experience with offering restorative justice in no way says, I'm going to now advocate that the person gets out. I think what you're going to have is people that say, hey, this is what matters to me, whether it's my bike was stolen or my child was sexually abused or I was a victim of a carjacking. I think most people would say, I don't want it to ever happen to me again, but I don't want it to happen to anybody else. So why don't we invest in helping the very people that at times are doing things that is either dangerous or frightening or scary or whatever, and give lots and lots of help and support and information and maybe therapy and maybe, the opportunity to really look at accountability, because for me, and for some people, maybe an apology sometimes is what we're looking for. And for other people, it's, hey, who are you now? How have you changed? How are you different from the 17-year-old kid that was convicted of shooting a police officer or, starting an arson? How have you changed? And sometimes I think we throw away people and we forget that many times they do want a second chance or a third chance or a fifth chance, and that they are now very different than who they were and how they were thinking and what they thought how to get some of their needs met was problematic. I get that. But I'm also, every single circle I've ever done, from homicide cases, and please understand, I've responded to the Parkland shooting for 9 days. I recently came back from Lewiston, Maine. And even then, I kept hearing people that were saying their anger wasn't at the individual, it was at the ability to buy firearms, automatic rifles that could do so much damage in 4 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes. So I think sometimes even individuals in the wake of tragedy are asking for very different levels of repair and accountability. But most often we just don't want this to happen again. And if we're really focusing on that question as a piece of justice, then what would that look like? It would mean investing in increasing the humanity and the peace building of people who have caused harm. And as so many of the rest of the speakers have said tonight, unlearning some of the choices and unlearning and learning from the damage that's been done to them and has maybe never ever been addressed or healed or adequately figured out. Because I'll say this, in terms of how do we honor victims and survivors and people on both sides of a conflict, I think we have to recognize that there are just many, many messy problems that are impossible for one person alone to fix. And that's where I think we have collective responsibility to offer and extend as many chances for people to do the right thing after the wrong thing has happened or taken place.
Thank you, Gretchen. That's interesting because I feel the only people who have the accountability are the ones who are going into the prisons. And then, everyone else, especially the legislators, need some cover. To make sure that we're not pointing a finger at these policies that were created. But, what I'd like to see is that somebody stands up and say, we made a mistake. Let's fix this together.
Give you an example, Cindy, where,
Thank you.
and to something Gary said earlier about, we're not necessarily listening to all sides and supporting victims, even to that point when we're just telling them what they need without even listening to them. A good example is West Virginia has a bill that just got introduced that would give people on parole and probation good time credit, basically, to allow them to get off of parole and probation earlier if they do stuff like go to college, productive things as a citizen. But as usual, anybody who has a sex offense is excluded from that. And if you were listening to all the people in this scenario, you could help victims in this scenario and the people who are on parole and probation by saying, okay, it's not a one size fits all. For people who have these kinds of offenses, they can participate in a restorative type justice process or scenario and get time off of parole and probation. But as opposed to that, it's just, we can't possibly be soft on, criminals. So we have to, never say we have to exclude all that. It just never, it's always just this one size fits all instead of how best can we help people in this scenario. And if you were listening to victims like you should be, and ask victims if restorative justice is something they would be interested in, I think that the significant majority of them would say, especially the adult ones, would say yes. And giving people opportunity to do that and facilitate it by giving people incentives on both sides of the house is how we move forward, as opposed to just doing this all the time.
What about upstream policies, right? Like restorative justice is still downstream, right? Something has taken place, a behavior, some wrongdoing, an amends, so to speak. What you got, Alissa, forensic criminologist, right? I knew you when we were still labeling people. We've all grown and changed. And when I hear from people that say, I'm never going to change my mind about you. I'm never going to vote for you. And I'm like, what do you mean never? How can you say never when we're all changing? But so what would your vision be of upstream real prevention policies that could help keep our kids, our young adults, out of harm's way and also out of the legal system?
So I actually don't think restorative justice is necessarily downstream. And in fact, I actually argue for restorative prevention, which is upstream, right? So, to me, restorative justice is not a thing that we do. It is who we are as facilitators. It is a way of life. It is a value set. And when we use that value set in all of our communications with people, that's what shifts things, right? So whether it's restorative parenting, I use restorative values in my classroom. So even before harm happens, even before somebody cheats on an exam, even before my kid lies to me for the umpteenth time about something, we've already started those conversations about accountability and responsibility and a common humanity, and that there's nothing that my child can say to me or do that would make me not love my child, right? And we teach, how do we communicate about these things? How do we have more in-depth conversations as a family or as a community or as a classroom before harm happens? So, well, I think in the sense of, a harm has happened or a crime has happened and we use it downstream, I actually am always arguing for using it upstream too, in how we talk about consent education and how we talk about sex ed, you name it. It's how we communicate with one another. And I think as facilitators who do this work, we can lead by example in how we communicate with those around us.
Gary, you're the father of 4 children. What are you suggesting when it comes to prevention?
I don't have a magic prescription for prevention. I do think that in terms of response to these things, which is kind of what this is about, I agree with Alissa that we can learn different ways of operating that are helpful. But in terms of how we respond, because that's where I am as a legislator, right? In terms of how we respond, I think the most important thing for us is to be confronted with a reality that we haven't had to face. And that is that, the people we talk about, I'm repeating myself, aren't the same. And I think it's important. Like, and I've told this before, when we were doing the death penalty abolition, the thing that actually moved folks was to have people who were in that victim space come and say, all the stuff you've always been saying about what we want, it's not what I want. It's not what my mother, father, whoever who lost someone because someone murdered them ever wanted. That is just not true. And then we had some folks who were in a little bit different space who were like, that's what I wanted then, and that's not what I want now, right? To the point of how people change. And it was difficult because the legislature really wasn't of the mind that people were in that space, because the people that always been trotted out were always the people that agreed with, we want justice in the form that we've always had it. And so I think, the work that I want to continue to engage in is the work of demonstrating that it's not that easy. It just never is that easy. And if we care about justice, we really care about justice, we have to confront the uneasiness. And then from there, we can make better choices. But do I have a prescription? I would write all kinds of books if I did.
Well, I would definitely plug Stop It Now. I took I think a 20-hour prevention of child sexual abuse class. And certainly for a person of my age, my parents didn't have the talk with me. I didn't have the talk with my son. And it was very similar to many of the women, either younger or my age, in the breakout rooms with us, is that we didn't have the talks. And there's so much more we could be doing. And communication is really, to me, because I lacked it, probably until I was about 51 years old, communication is the real intimacy, right? And so now that I've got it, I wish I could bottle it and give it away, but I'm going to enjoy it every day I'm still here. I just want to ask the people who are left, 'cause we're going to head out, but does somebody have a question that they'd like to pose to the group, and then we'll say goodnight? I know Quince is on the phone from Maryland. Amy from New Haven Legal Clinic. Anybody have one question they'd like to ask? Gretchen, I think you touched somebody with a similar story. Did you see it in the chat room? Thank you. All right, so quiet group. Final words, and then we'll say goodnight. I want to thank you so much. Heck, maybe next year I'll tell my story. But for being vulnerable and for, you know, we got to speak plainly and make sure that we're heard, right? And even though it's a complex, nuanced area, and yet the law is black and white. I think that's why Kelly Sosha did so well. It was sort of, you know, Carl can be very heavy in terms of the academic and the jargon and the analytical side, and Kelly was, you know, the other end of the spectrum. So maybe we'll have to get Carl, Alissa, and Kelly on the phone next year. But let's see. Oh, here's Amy Epler-Epstein. My only question thought is that before this, I had often heard that restorative justice was not for domestic violence type crimes where there is such power inequity. Yeah, that is totally false. In fact, Colorado's been doing it probably for about 5 to 8 years within judicial, actually. But does anybody else want to talk about the domestic violence area with restorative justice?
I'll say just real briefly that I think that if you've got two individuals that have no safety concerns and there's a lot of preparation that's offered and extended, and as a facilitator, you are really conscientious about looking at, and I don't mean to use the word vetting, but really do a lot of preparation, that I think that whether the power imbalances with the church and an individual or between intimate partners, is that there are times and places where people can, and I've certainly been a facilitator in intimate partner violence, and some of it is because people are planning to stay together. And so my response sometimes to people is, as hard as it is to understand this, many people are going to still want to be with someone who has caused them harm. They are committed spiritually, romantically, financially, because they have kids together. What they want is the violence to stop. What they want is the harm to be addressed. And so if restorative justice can be used, a process can be used along with other options too. I'm not saying restorative justice is a one-all. You have one circle and it's one and done. I think it can be a means of helping someone truly begin to see and understand the impact. Now, again, the way many facilitators, I certainly do restorative justice, is we don't even get to a circle if the individual's not willing to admit what they did do, what their behavior involved. And a lot of that preparation is their ability. I mean, you got to be pretty brave to face someone that you've hurt, whether it's because of infidelity, because of sexual violence, because of physical harm, because of repeatedly or chronic behavior that's been very, very troubling and terrifying for someone. You got to have a lot of support. You know, we talk about being brave tonight, us talking, but you got to be really brave to really look at what you've done and be willing to demonstrate accountability and ask for help. And so I would never say that there's anything that's not an option for restorative justice unless the parties themselves have safety concerns, or there is just individuals or institutions are not going to allow it to happen. They simply are not going to be in favor of it. But I think the people that are most directly impacted are in a position to decide whether this is something they both want to do for the purpose of addressing recognizing the impact and doing what is humanly possible to repair the harm that has taken place or reduce the impact of the harm or to make things simply better going forward.
So I'll just repeat, Amy, that, and then we're gonna say goodnight, that the restorative justice is working for domestic violence situations in judicial and has been for many years. And the reason for it is, besides partners who might want to stay together, many of these couples have children together. And to reunify and teach them how to communicate without the anger is really important so that the kids can keep both parents. And of course that remains to be seen. Are they willing to learn? Are they willing to do the work? And Kathy Gorley from Michigan was on, I don't know if she's still on, but I can share a video on RJ for domestic violence with you. So, does anybody, Gary, good night.
Thank you.
Let Gary Jr. and Imani go put you to bed, honey, and we'll see you in the morning. But
All
no,
right.
Gary was saying, Alyssa's got, everybody's been great. Quiet audience, but let's see if there's any. Okay. Carol Boggs is saying, thank you, much food for thought.
I'm giving you the queen wave.
I just want to thank everybody because, Gary Winfield, we always ask him, like, how are we going to change things? How are we going to get more legislators to the table? How are we going to get people that are willfully ignoring, willfully denying? And Gary says, and Alissa probably says this too, you keep having conversations like this. So thank you so much, because you guys are the ever ready bunnies. You just keep on giving. And I know we've got a worldwide RJ community, and we kind of love each other. So that's what we do.
I love you, man.
All right. So good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Gary, thank you. Alissa, I'll see you soon, honey. Gretchen, we'll talk.
Thanks,
Philip,
Cindy.
thank you. Good night.
Good
Good night,
night.
everybody.